to
We're
wait till October.
trying.
Yeah.
We're trying to keep it moving.
Yeah.
But I really wanted to let folks know how we met and
Mhm.
then give an opportunity to talk about this book. I want you to hear this book. I'm going to see if you do a little reading. You
Sure.
said you do a little bit.
Yeah.
And then we can get into some questions because this person is incredible. And I just want you to be able to soak in all of this energy. So we this summer decided to find ourselves at the White House.
Yes.
It was my first time to the White House. For many of y'all know, as much as I do serve in the government, I'm not the most proximate to certain political parts of our country. And so we find ourselves at the White House lawn.
Mhm.
How'd you get there?
Same reason you got there.
Uh-huh.
It was the Pride Month celebration for the White House. So, yeah.
And so everyone's moving around. The event is kind of ending down.
Yeah.
People are headed out for the exit, and we're kind of straggling.
Yeah, we're hanging out.
I mean, wouldn't you take your last minute
at the White House?
At the White House?
Yeah.
So we run into each other,
Yeah.
and we start discussing how difficult it is writing a book, putting it out, going on tour, doing all of that. So tonight we wanted to bring together some Atlantans to just really bolster this book's journey.
Yep.
As a new author, we salute you. We commend you.
Thank you.
And so your book, it tells your stories.
Well, and also I just want to say I'm really excited to be back here. There's each chapter of my book is centered on one of my tattoos, and we can delve into why that is later. But there's a whole chapter centered on my peach tattoo that I have on my arm, which is for Georgia. Because for those of y'all who arrived early enough, I did briefly live here for a couple months. Back in 2020, I was running a congressional campaign in Texas, and we lost because no one running a progressive congressional campaign in Texas wins, unfortunately. And when we lost, then y'all found yourselves in this Senate runoff here for both Senators Warnock and Ossoff. And so all of us kind of damaged Texans, we picked up our bags and we all caravanned out here, and we spent a few months here. So I was about a month in Atlanta, and then eventually they had us all splitting up and staying all over the state. So I like to say that I've been in like every crevice of Georgia. They had some of us in specific spots. So I was in a spot called Thomaston for a while. If y'all have any idea, small rural community. I wouldn't know it either if I hadn't spent so much time there. But yeah, so I spent about a month here in Atlanta, and that's when I believe, became exposed to like you or your work or something. Yeah, back then. And then, yeah, and honestly, so the reason why I got and you'll read more about it in the book, but I've worked on many campaigns, but that was the only campaign that I've worked on that we ever won. And so it was like a very special moment for me. I still remember, and I'm staying back in the same Airbnb where I stayed the month that I was here in Atlanta. And I remember being in that house the night that it happened. And that was just like epic, because obviously all progressive campaigns in the South matter. But I mean, these Senate races were huge, not just for Georgia, but for the entire country and the world, frankly.
Oh yeah.
So this state is special to me, and this city is really special to me. I have like very, very, as an organizer, to finally win a campaign, like, you're always going to remember that for the rest of your life. So I'm happy to be back.
Yes, no, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I think we all remember really that time. I found myself at a gas station crying.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the hard work that you have put in electorally and politically, you write about it, these memoirs.
Yeah.
And so you're talking about your identities, you're talking about your life stories. For anyone who's unaware, what does it mean to be intersex, and how do your stories start to come out in this juicy book?
Yeah. So to be intersex is kind of exactly what it sounds like. If you break the word down, intersex, it means between the sexes. So a lot of people understand in this day and age that sexuality is not binary. It's not, you're not just gay or you're straight. There's a whole spectrum in between. some people are starting to understand now too that gender is also not binary. You're not just a man or a woman. There's this whole spectrum in between as well. What people have not started to understand enough yet is that sex is also not binary. And the distinction between sex and gender being sex is like the physical anatomy that you're born with. And so to be trans means that your gender does not align with your sex. Your gender does not align with the physical parts that you were born with. So intersex people, we're born with physical traits that fall somewhere on the spectrum in between male and female. And so, there's a broad range of intersex variations. We have all different body types. We can talk about mine in particular in a minute. But one thing that I like to remind folks too is that the spectrum of sex does not only apply to intersex folks. We are all on a spectrum. So some cis men can grow a full beard and some barely grow peach fuzz. Some cis women grow really big boobs and some are flat chested. So all of us have sex traits that are on a spectrum. Intersex people just happen to be closer to the center of that spectrum. And so we tend to have different body parts and it can be anything from hormones, chromosomes, internal reproductive organs, external genitalia. Any of our sex traits don't fit neatly into those two categories on a birth certificate. And unfortunately, because a birth certificate only has those two categories, if we are born not fitting into one of those two, rather than adding an extra box on the piece of paper, they force our body to fit into one of those boxes that is on the piece of paper. And so what that means is oftentimes we undergo surgeries without our consent, or they pump us with hormones without our consent, to force our bodies to fit better into those male or female categories. So for me, I have XY chromosomes, which most people who are not as educated and enlightened as those of us in this room associate just purely with being male. And I was born looking very female, presenting very femme on the outside. But on the inside, instead of being born with a uterus and ovaries, I was born with internal testes. And the doctors removed those from me in infancy and a bunch of other stuff that, again, we'll get into in a minute. But yeah, we're 2% of the world is born like us. And to put that in context, that's the same amount of people as are born with red hair.
Yeah, redheads. Yeah.
It's the same amount of people as are born with green eyes.
Yep.
And if you put it in equivalent numbers, 2% of the world is around 150 million people. That's around half the population of the United States. And so we're not even rare. It's just we are silenced, and we're silenced by conversion therapy. It's not the conversion therapy that doctors used to use, and still maybe in some places use on gay kids, where they try to electric shock the gay out of you. It's conversion therapy where they try to operate the intersex out of you. So they, rather than using electric shocks, they're using scalpels, and they're literally cutting pieces of our bodies out of us without our consent to make us fit better onto a piece of paper. And so what we like to say is like, why do you need to like force mutilate children to fit onto a piece of paper when you could just change the piece of paper?
Right. Hello.
Yeah.
And we've been trying in Georgia and Chicago. They've been successful. I mean, politically, we were connected years and years ago.
Yes.
Sai, when we were still working together in the corner over here, we were working with someone who now you're in the movies with.
Yeah.
I mean, you literally, your story's connected.
With Saifa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so.
Because Saifa used to live here. So have any of y'all seen Everybody yet, the movie? So you have a few of y'all? Yeah. So the movie, it's about me and two other intersex people. One of them is Saifa, who he used to live here in Atlanta. And the cool thing about the movie, I think, is that sharing all three of our stories, you see a white intersex woman, you see a black intersex man, and you see a non-binary intersex Latinx person. And so it really shows that your sex has no bearing on your gender. It has no bearing on anything else. It's just It's just the physical parts that you're born with. And I think the movie does a really good job of sharing three wildly different stories, not just in terms of our identities, but we all also approach our activism in very different ways. So River is an actor in Hollywood. Saifa is an academic getting his PhD in the UK. Sorry, I'm burping. And I work in politics in Texas. So yeah, if you haven't seen the movie yet, y'all should definitely watch it.
So the movie, came about because of your journey, because of connecting. Saifa was coming to my office, to the Capitol, and saying, how can we change, legislation addressing our community years ago?
Yeah.
And I'm excited to see that all of the work that you're doing, people can easily stream it, easily watch it. But if you were to just, summate a little bit, as this book came about, what were the questions you wanted people to have answered? And how did your story start to share that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So in general, there's just no intersex representation in culture. I mean, there's like one book, everyone always refers to Middlesex. They're like, oh, that's that book, Middlesex, which I haven't read yet. Apparently it's pretty good, but I don't know. It was not written by an intersex person. I'm not sure how accurate it is. I have not read it. And there's like one other intersex movie that I know of. And there's like an intersex character or two written into TV shows, but it was like, there's like one episode on House. So it's like a 30-minute, episode or whatever. So there's very, very little intersex representation in culture in general. And I wanted to help change that. The reason the book came about actually is I was in Portland visiting a friend, and I was at a bookstore called Powell's Books in Portland, which is like one of the most famous bookstores in the country, if not the world. And they had this whole section of Powell's labeled trans, intersex, and genderqueer. I was like, that's so cool. So I went up to that section, and it's a room. Powell's is huge. So they have multiple floors, like maybe 6 floors or something. And each floor is like larger than this entire building. And so the section labeled trans, intersex, and genderqueer was probably the size of this room. It was like all these shelves. And I was like, oh, this is so cool. And I went up and I read every title of every book on every shelf, and there was not one intersex book. And so this section was labeled trans, intersex, and genderqueer, but there were no intersex stories. And I was like, if this ain't a representative of the queer community at large, because everyone's like, oh, we call it LGBTQIA now. Like now we're inclusive of intersex people. And I'm like, really? So like, what are intersex people fighting for? What does intersex mean? I even trip people up over that question. Like even in the queer community, they're like, oh, no. I think a lot of people think it's like a fancy way of saying non-binary or something, or like, I don't know. I don't know what they think it means, but but I was in that room and I could not find one intersex book, and I just started crying like in Powell's, like on the floor of Powell's Books, and that in that moment I was like, I'm gonna write a book and I'm gonna make sure that it's stocked here in Powell's Books, and that it's gonna be on those shelves in Powell's Books. And so I'm gonna be doing a book event just like we're doing here now in Portland in November, and if it's not there, there's going to be hell to pay.
Clap it up for that one time.
But yeah, so overall, I wanted to add more intersex representation just in general. There's very, very little of it. But also, I think of the representation that there is, it tends to be like sob stories and really sad. And I think we need some of that for sure, because there's a lot of really bad stuff that happens to us, and we deserve better. But I know that the whole reason I came out is because, and I was 27 at this point. So I spent like 27 years of my life deeply closeted. And the whole motivation for me to come out was I was reading this story in Vogue magazine about this model who came out as being intersex. And I had never heard the word intersex, because when you're born intersex, they don't tell you like, oh, you're born in between 2% of the world's born like this. You have this whole community around the world that you can connect with of people like you. Like, it's great. They tell you like, you have a disorder of sexual development. You should never tell anyone because you'll be made fun of and you'll never find a good husband one day. And don't worry, we're going to fix you. And so they give you surgeries and they give you hormones and they tell you never to tell anyone. So like my brother didn't even know. Like my parents knew and the doctors knew, and that was it. like none of my family members, none of my friends, no one. Um, and so I had never even heard this word intersex, but I was living in Texas at the time. I was 27 years old.
Mhm.
I was reading Vogue magazine. And because, backtrack, speaking of
Mhm.
reproductive rights,
Mhm.
I used to work with this woman named Wendy Davis, who I'm not sure if any of y'all are feminist nerds, but
Come
when
on.
Wendy Davis was a state senator in Texas who at one point she filibustered for, yeah,
Filibuster.
for like 16 hours on the floor
Yes.
of the Texas Senate. So that means for 16 hours, she had to keep talking. She wasn't allowed to stop talking.
Yep.
She couldn't take a drink of water. She couldn't use the restroom. She couldn't stop talking. She couldn't do anything. She had to wear a diaper. She had
Y'all
to wear a
remember this?
catheter.
Y'all remember
Yeah.
this? Okay, because Georgia was watching because then,
The
you
whole
know,
world was watching.
yeah.
So I had never even been to Texas at this point.
Uh-huh.
I'm from Philadelphia. I've lived all over, as you heard in my intro. But everyone, Georgia, the whole world was watching.
Yeah.
Like, was watching Texas. So this woman, Wendy Davis, she's a hero, obviously. And at a certain point, long story short, she had invited me to move to Texas to help her launch a nonprofit. She had run for governor of Texas. She had lost because the Republicans kept calling her abortion Barbie, which doesn't go over well in Texas. And so she lost her governor's race and she wanted to then found a nonprofit
Yep.
to train the next generation of young women activists in Texas.
Yep.
And she moved me to Texas to help her do that because I had helped launch all of these other nonprofits. And so I was working with her at the time. And if you know Wendy, she's like super fashionable. She always like dressed to the nines, like Texas, like the big hair, like all this stuff. And so she had a copy of Vogue magazine in the office. And one day I was flipping through it and I started reading this story about this model.
Wow.
And she was intersex. And I had never heard this word, but I was like, oh, the surgeries and the hormones and the doctors telling you never to tell anyone. And like your parent, like whatever.
Swirling.
And I was like, what is happening? And I went home that night and I like Googled intersex and I went down this Wikipedia rabbit hole for like 8 hours. And I was like, holy crap, like I'm intersex. Like I'm not alone in the world. There are other people like me. And so it was that story that ultimately led to me coming out. And I don't think I would have if it hadn't been a story about a badass person, like living their life, like kicking ass, being
Yes.
like really just killing it in the world. If it had just been this sob story about this poor mutilated kid who like doctors were like shaming and like they're crying all the time and everyone's ashamed of, like I don't think I ever would have come out because if you're going to risk so much to share this like new piece of who you are and your identity and whatever, like you have to be empowered to do so. And so I didn't want my book to be like a pity party. I like have this line in it. I was like, this isn't a story of being intersad. It's a story of intersexcellence. And so like, yeah. And so that's what I really wanted. The first chapter, we go at a high level into some of the stuff that I suffered, but I wanted that to like, I needed it to set the scene, but I wanted it to inspire other people and be like, oh, wow, like there are badass intersex people and like I can be one of those.
And you are.
Thank you. Yeah, but that's what, yeah. So I hope it'll inspire other people to come out. I hope it'll inspire other allies to join our cause. But then above all, honestly, my book is a book about healing. And so whether you're queer or you're not, or you're intersex or not, or whatever, like my book is kind of a roadmap to what healing has looked like for me because it was a very long journey. It was like a 3-decade long journey and it was not easy, but I believe we all deserve to heal and we all deserve to like be proud of who we are and feel safe and comfortable in our identity. And so, but I think anyone can get something from the book, like whether or not your life looks anything like mine. It talks about all the different ways, my pathway to healing.
Now the book is called Inverse Cowgirl.
Yes.
Come on, I'm curious. But at the same time, the stories, the chapters.
Yeah.
What's your favorite chapter? Let's get in there. But tell us about the title and then let's get into the chapter.
Good question. Yeah. So Inverse Cowgirl is a play on reverse cowgirl, which do y'all know reverse cowgirl? So the reason I ask is because I was just on CBS Mornings with Gayle King. Oh, no.
Yes, honey. Did y'all see her? You have to follow her.
who's
Sure.
who's Oprah's best friend.
Mhm.
And Gail asked me the same question you did.
Mhm.
And I was like, yeah, it's a play on reverse cowgirl. She's like, reverse cowgirl? I was like, yeah, reverse cowgirl. And she's like, what's that? I was like, oh, honey, this is 7 a.m. on a Monday,
Yep.
by the way. And I'm backstage on
Yep.
CBS Mondays with Gail King explaining reverse cowgirl
Yes.
to Gail King. And then the whole rest of the morning when we were filming, she's asking everyone. She's asking the hair person, the makeup person, the cameraman, the gaffer, the lighting people. She's like, hey, like, Bob, do you know what reverse cowgirl is? And was like, yes, Gail. Literally every other person's like, yes, girl.
I love it.
I know what reverse cowgirl is.
I love
So if I have any legacy in the world, it's teaching Gail King what reverse cowgirl is.
Yeah.
But anyway, so it's a play on reverse cowgirl, but it's also because I'm intersex in Texas. So instead of reverse cowgirl, it's inverse cowgirl. But then I also talk about in the book how an inverse cowgirl is anyone who's kind of going against the norm of what's expected of you, like you're inverse of what society expects or what society wants you to be. And then the cowgirl thing is like riding the frontier, like pushing the boundaries, like being, going against the grain again. So anyone can be an inverse cowgirl. It's like if you are defying norms, going against what's expected, going against what you're supposed to be, what society tells you to be, then you're an inverse cowgirl too.
Come on, room full of inverse cowgirls.
Yeah.
No, for real though. I love it.
Thank
I really,
you.
really have been excited to see how you put your personality into the book.
Thank you.
The voice that you're hearing right here, it's
in
in
the book.
book.
It is. Yeah.
It's very, readable. Do you want to share a little bit? You want to read a little?
Sure. Yeah. I'm trying to think of like what part I should read. Do you have any part you think I should read? No.
Let's go. Okay.
So I have one part that I usually read that I'm happy to do, unless you think there's like a particular.
No, we want to hear your voice.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah, I'll read a little bit at the end of the preface here. So I start off talking about the documentary that I was in. Actually, I'll start one paragraph earlier and explain to y'all why each of the chapters of my book are based off of one of my tattoos. I achieve embodiment through my tattoos. A lot of the decisions about what happened to my body or what it would look like were taken away from me as a kid. So getting inked helps me literally own my own skin. Each tat is something that I find beautiful and correlates to a specific phase of my life or facet of my being. I hope that weaving these stories together based on the designs on my skin will help y'all connect the dots on why we intersex people deserve control over our own lives, what our physical appearance looks like, and what goes on underneath it. We all deserve autonomy over our bodies. While many intersex activists advocate for abortion access, I hope the essays that follow might generate reciprocal support. Perhaps you found your way here through watching Everybody, the Focus Features documentary that includes my work, which also dives into the story of John Money, a Johns Hopkins research doctor who's responsible for a lot of the current medical injustice we face today. I haven't mentioned much medical research here. The goal, rather, is to share real stories to help regain the humanity that's been stripped of us, having been treated as specimens by Dr. Money and others who have followed in his footsteps. His work sufficiently dehumanized us to be able to justify the abuse we face. In a 1963 medical theater, he referred to us as presenting a strange partial reversal in human beings. I hope through reading this book, you'll determine that we are, not so strange. I will not bear the label of a partially reversed human, but I do wear the badge of inverse cowgirl with pride. This book isn't just for other intersex people, though I do hope they may feel seen in these pages. An inverse cowgirl is anyone whose experience defies the expected and turns societal notions upside down. I'm writing this for everyone who doesn't fit neatly into a box, who's always felt too this or not enough that. I still wrestle with feeling too intersex to fit in cis women's circles, but at the same time, too heteronormative to fit into queer spaces. Every human sometimes feels like a lone ranger, but the more we signal our weirdness to the world, the easier it'll be to find one another and feel more at home on the range. This manifesto isn't a call to think outside the box. It's an invitation to dream beyond boxes. We are not outside or other. The box doesn't actually exist. We do. Whatever box white supremacy or the cis heteropatriarchy is trying to shove you in, resist. Intersex bodies are a walking reminder to hold space for the both ands in life. We can be any and all things all of the time. I'm a city official and an underwear model. I wear both of those badges with equal pride. To anyone who never really fit into whatever box the world tried to place you in, congrats, you've won. If it doesn't feel that way yet, consider following along on my journey as a pathway to the winner's circle. I always preferred circles to squares anyway. The unbroken circle on the intersex flag symbolizes wholeness and completeness. Regardless of what any of us has been led to believe on the basis of our sex, gender, persuasion, race, religion, or whatever other label we carry, we are enough. And that's more than enough editorializing in the abstract when there's a weird and windy road ahead of us. Let's ride.
Yeah.
So that's the end of the preface. And it gets, and when you said it's in my voice, it is. There's a lot of stuff in here. There's a lot. You're going to get a lot in here.
Y'all are going to love it. And I'm looking forward to making sure that you're supporting Kara's books tonight, that you're buying this book. You're going to get your signed copy. If you're tuned in online, that you're going ahead and placing your order. It can be delivered to you. We can get it signed for you today. So today is really the moment to just connect with you, because you are one of us. We've got you.
Thank
we
you.
love that you love us. And hopefully y'all will consider having an event to which you're bringing her expertise and to which you're sharing this book. Holiday season is coming up. These are perfect gifts.
Perfect holiday gifts.
Signed today.
And I do like to say, especially, so intersex issues tend to be a good gateway issue for people understanding other things like being trans. So if you have conservative family members or family members who aren't really getting it, a lot of folks use us as almost like the gotcha argument, because they're like, oh, well, if people's bodies are born physically in between, why would it not make sense that like mentally, spiritually, emotionally, people might also not identify in one of these two categories? Like, and also if people understand that there are, so all the anti-trans legislation across the country that is seeking to ban trans care for minors, it includes specific loopholes that also target the intersex community. So these bills, they say you can't give surgery and hormones to trans kids who want them, but you can force the same surgeries and the same hormones on intersex kids who haven't asked for them. And what that shows people is that this legislation is not based in biology. It's not based in science. It's not based in what's healthy for children, which is what they're all out here claiming. They're like, this is to protect children. These legislators are out here calling trans care, they're calling it child abuse. So you're okay with abusing trans kids. You're not okay with abusing trans kids, but you're okay with abusing intersex kids? Or they're saying like, oh, trans kids, they're too young to consent to this sort of these procedures, these surgeries and these hormones. So trans kids are too young to consent, but intersex kids are not too young to consent?
Right.
It makes no sense. It just shows the hypocrisy. It's written into their own bills. And so honestly, like intersex issues tend to be a really good gateway for other people to understand why all of these attacks on trans people are so ridiculous and unfounded. And so intersex issues tend to be a good gateway issue. And I talk about this all the time with Sypha, actually. I also tend to be like a good gateway intersex person. Like Sypha is the one who called me, I think, a sleeper cell, because like I look like Tommy Lauren or whatever.
Right?
Right?
Yeah.
So like, I look out here like the way that I do, and then I'm out here spouting all this stuff and people are like, "What?" And so it's like I tend to be like a lot of the people who won't listen to other folks, like they will listen to me. And then they hear what I'm saying and they're like, "Oh, like now I'm like thinking a little bit differently about stuff than I was before." And so I try to use that to my advantage.
Come on.
It's like weaponizing your privilege, right?
Oh, for sure. I use fashion at the Capitol. The Republic, they won't talk to me. But if I got these on, right? You know what I mean? Got a little flair going.
Totally.
And so I'm glad that your book is going to continue to remind folks we can be our own versions of inverse cowgirls.
Yes.
These are great gifts for this holiday season. I cannot stress enough. Get a signed copy today because you will write a special little message.
I will.
For the Georgia Peaches.
Yes.
So we can get to these next electoral seasons. The other day, and you would love this.
Yeah.
I was at this fashion event.
Yeah.
And so they said, come on stage, let's talk to everyone.
Yeah.
So I asked, does anyone know when the next election is in Georgia? And no one knew.
Yeah, of course.
No one knew. And so I just want to thank you for bridging the gap to always bring it back to electoral cycles, because for us, sometimes it gets difficult to try to re-engage people and remind pretty much every November there's going to be an election.
And you reminded me by saying that. I know I already read a chapter, but I kind of want to read this part since I'm sitting here with y'all, because this is about Georgia.
Bring it home.
Okay. And it's about exactly what you just talked about in electoral politics. So I usually wouldn't read this part or this much at an event like this, but it's just like a page or so. So this is when I mentioned to y'all that I was staying here in Atlanta 3 years ago now for the Warnock and Ossoff campaigns. We spent our days at a frantic pace, knocking on doors across various regions of Atlanta and nearby cities, and executing outreach to bring more volunteers and dollars on board. So, by the way, I was staying in this Airbnb, and I was staying in the AAPI organizer's house. So I was dating this Indian political candidate at the time. So I was staying in this house with all these Asian folks, and I was like the one random white girl. But so it says, at night, we would congregate back at the Goat House to host K-pop dance parties in our pajamas and share food from the variety of cultures represented in our ranks. Eventually, we needed all hands on deck to expand the reach of our efforts and took to staying in hotels in far-reaching corners of the state. Blah, 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 blah. We met Georgians of every background imaginable, but I remember Shara's story. This is what I wanted to share. Shara's story in the tiny town of Thomaston as particularly emblematic of what kept us going at warp speed. Shara is a 60-something-year-old Black woman with locks dyed the color of red velvet, as she put it. She had made various requests for a mail-in ballot as she wanted to avoid being exposed to COVID at the polls, having suffered a stroke in 2016 and struggled with high blood pressure and diabetes since. The ballot never came, and she wasn't surprised. They didn't want to hear from me, she told me, tears in her eyes, but my life really is dependent on this, so I'm going to put my life in jeopardy to vote. I'm going to go out there and take a chance and head to the Civic Center and chance catching COVID because they've got their foot on my neck, but they're not going to suppress me. When I asked Shara whether she'd voted before, she told me that she had felonies in her record and hadn't been able to vote for 6 decades, including for Barack Obama, but finally got to cast her first ballot against Trump in 2020. I've seen some things, especially here in Georgia in a rural town, so I got something to say with my vote. I never got that feeling before, but now I feel it and I like it. Shara asked me why she couldn't vote on Monday, and I told her that it was because early voting had ended. She had to wait until the next day, Election Day proper. I told her that she was given the wrong voting date on purpose, and that I had had to correct several of her neighbors. If they're doing this to little old nobody like me, not sending me a ballot, she pondered, they're trying to stop me from voting? That really inspires me to show up and do it. They're trying to scare me, trying to stop me. It's not going to be that easy. I don't have religion, but I have faith. I have faith this is not going to work. We do have a say. At this point, I was in tears. I made sure Shara knew to show up on the 5th, not the 4th, and I gave her an extra face mask emblazoned with the word vote on it to help protect her. I gathered my campaign literature and left her porch as she called out to me, "Tell every hoe you know." I'll never forget Shara. She was the first person I thought of when both Warnock, a black Georgian like her, and Ossoff won a few days later. This win was momentous not just for residents of the Peach State like Shara, but for all Americans and, frankly, the world.
Thank
So,
you.
yeah. Georgia holds like a very, very special place in my heart. Like, voter suppression is very real here. It's very real across the South, including in Texas where I live. But thank God we have folks like Park out here advocating for all of us.
Well,
right?
everyone, just make sure you check your voter registrations
Yeah.
by next week. It's pretty much over after that
Yeah.
for the November election to change your registration. But now let's get into some questions.
Yeah.
What's the date, Park? Let's give them the real date. for
It's the
change.
16th, but I'm
16th.
trying to tell y'all next week so that you do it later,
earlier. Get that
It's
hard
next
day.
week.
Do it next week.
16th of November is the deadline to
16th
register.
of October.
Of October, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Of October. So it's soon, y'all.
It's soon. Get it together.
Very soon.
Does anyone have a question? What do you want to start
let's
us
get
off?
into this. Let's ask a question. One for the room.
Yeah, I'm gonna bring you the mic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. All the readings, and this was
Yeah.
the energy in this room is wonderful.
Yay.
So my name is Megan. I am a professor at Emory, and I'm looking forward to using your story in a class about
Wow.
feminist neuroscience.
Thank you.
And so what I want to know is if you had something to say to like college kids or something that you want them specifically to take from this book. These are future scientists, people who might be in the medical field. Like, what is something that you hope that group of students gets from your story?
Wow, that's such a good question. You said neuroscience. Wow. Yeah, so part of my story, you asked me before what my favorite chapter is. My
Yeah.
favorite chapter is actually my my chapter about being diagnosed as bipolar. And so I talk about how physically I'm intersex. So physically I'm born in between what's considered normal. Like there's male and there's female, and I was born in between. Mentally I'm bipolar, so I'm considered on the outskirts of what's normal, like on the extremes of what's normal. So like physically and mentally I'm like not in like the right place that you're supposed to be. But what I talk about specifically with being bipolar is how it's both like my biggest weakness and my greatest strength. It's all about how you channel it and making sure that you're like healing and managing it properly, and what my process to like owning that looked like and how it was really rough. And I kind of had to like hit rock bottom at certain points. And I used to really struggle with like substance abuse because of a lot of the medical abuse that I faced as a kid. And really like, but also being bipolar, I also have to say that it's like Kanye is just a bigot. Like he's not, being bipolar doesn't make you like a, you know, anti-Semitic asshole. Like that's just you, boo. like it that's not about being bipolar. That's just about, you gotta.
Yeah, the representation. I mean, one of your main themes of you is representation.
That's the only representation you see.
Right.
And so, yeah, I would say that for neuroscience students, they might get a lot out of that chapter in particular, but also just in general, that medicine, people tend to view doctors as gods. Like they just take whatever they have to say at face value. But like whether it's like fat phobia, whether it's okay, so being trans was considered a disorder up until like 5 years ago or something like that. It was in the DSM, which is the guidebook of like psychological disorders. Being intersex is still considered a disorder. Being gay used to be considered a disorder that they would try to like fix, right? And so people take the word of doctors as golden or whatever, but like people in medicine are just as flawed as any other institution. Like just like there are bigoted politicians, there are bigoted doctors. Like just like there people, everyone brings their unique lived experience and values and viewpoints to whatever profession there is. So if nothing else, like I hope this will encourage folks to question what they're taught. You know, intersex is barely taught about in med school at all. So I hope this will be like a jumping off point for people, and it won't be the only time that they hear an intersex story, the only intersex story they ever read. I do want to shout out my friend Pigeon, also has a book out right now who's intersex. It's called Nobody Needs to Know.
Okay.
And Pigeon is an incredible intersex activist who is like an OG in the movement. So I would highly recommend getting Nobody Needs to Know by Pigeon as well. So yeah, I hope it'll encourage your students to like question what they're thought and kind of think for themselves. And yeah.
Sounds like Emery will be hearing from you soon.
Yeah.
For you to be
Yeah.
guest lecture
Right?
and entire keynote book reception
Let's
at the
do it.
Candler. Okay, we got it. We'll all
Yes.
be there.
Yeah. Any other?
Yes, from corner to corner.
Yes.
Thank you. I also want to say thank you so much for being so vulnerable, giving us so much of yourself. I can
Thanks.
only imagine, how much, internally that took to put so much out in front of us.
Yeah.
So I am Sebastian, and I've
Hi.
actually had the opportunity to work with you before. I work at the National Center for Trans Equality.
Sebastian from NCTE.
That's me right here.
It's so good to see
It's
you.
so good to see you as well in
Yeah.
person. So,
Wow.
with that being said, and I know you touched on it as well, as we're talking about the anti-trans legislation that we're
Yes.
seeing, right?
Yes.
There's this need for more solidarity in our
Yes.
movement. And I just want
Yes.
you to speak to that, like speak to the
Mhm.
need, because I think sometimes there's this narrative that
Yes.
we're so far from each other, or, we're not supporting each other the same way. So just
Yeah.
speak to that need for solidarity between the two movements.
It's so good to meet you, by the
You
way.
as well.
Yeah. So I think what honestly happens is I talked about this. I was just on do y'all know JVN from Queer Eye?
Yeah, it's fun.
So JVN wrote the forward to my book, by the way. So
Yes.
and if you get the audiobook, they voice the forward to my book as well. But so I was just on their podcast and we talked about how not just in the queer community, but in activism in general, there tends to be this scarcity mindset.
Uh-huh.
And I think it does make sense to a certain extent because we're all out here fundraising and trying to keep the lights on. But I think there's this, it's not just about money. It's also about airtime. It's about media spotlight. It's about whatever that, like, if people are starting to get space in a movement and then someone else comes in the picture, everyone else is worried, like, oh, if they're here now, then there's less space for me. There's less money for me. Like there's less airtime for me. People aren't going to listen to me. And so I think, now that intersex voices are being heard, I think the rest of the queer community has been a little bit scared to embrace us. And I would think some of it's motivated by that. I also think that there's this feeling maybe that the intersex message muddles the rest of the messaging or confuses the rest of the messaging, because people were out here saying for a long time, like, there's surgeries don't happen on children and they don't happen on trans kids, but they do happen on intersex kids,
Right.
without our consent. So they're not given to people who want them with consent. They're forced on people who don't want them without consent. And I don't think that detracts from the message. If anything, that makes the message stronger. Like, we're not giving healthcare to people who want it. We're denying it to people who want it, and we're forcing it on people who have never asked for it.
Yeah.
If anything, it just underlines how none of it makes any sense. Also, just the trans and the intersex communities, we have so many things in common. So I'm on hormone replacement therapy because of a surgery that I underwent as a kid without my consent that took my hormone producing organs. They took my testes from me, which left me in permanent hormone withdrawal. So I have to take external hormones, which a lot of trans people also have to take external hormones. A lot of us have had surgeries. A lot of us have struggled with, boxes on medical forms. Like, we have so many things in common. Like, we are natural allies for one another. So I think there's just like a lot of fear that comes when there's new voices on the scene, when there's a new issue to learn. So I think it's like remaining curious and always being willing to like challenge your own notions on something. But I really do think, NCTE, we've been doing amazing work together, and I'm so grateful for NCTE, and I hope that the rest of the queer movement will eventually catch up.
There we go.
Yeah.
we have a lot of birth workers in the larger CARES
Yes.
community, and my sister is a labor and delivery nurse,
Yeah.
and has worked at a lot of the really big like birth factory hospitals
Ooh,
in
Yeah.
Atlanta, right?
Lord.
And I asked her one time, because I've known a lot of really amazing intersex activists and some
Yeah.
of the folks you mentioned, you know, well, what are they telling parents?
Yeah.
And she said, it's not good. And I
Yeah.
was like, you
Mhm.
know, well, I know people have been doing this work for 25 years.
Totally.
And the message, it's still
Yep.
it's still bad. And I have another good friend who has a young intersex child now, who was well informed ahead of having this child.
Mhm.
And so she was able to make informed choices
Yep.
on behalf of her child
Yep.
to not have any medical intervention and allow the child to grow up and
I love that.
and
There we
dictate,
go.
right?
Yeah.
And so it got me thinking, how do we do parental education before people give birth?
Yeah.
Because
Totally.
when I was talking to my sister and I've talked to other birth workers, it's like, you're in that room and people are like, what do you want to do?
Yeah.
Like, you're exhausted
Yeah.
from giving birth.
Yep.
This is like
Totally.
the most vulnerable time of your life.
Well, and oftentimes the doctors are underinformed, right?
Right.
They might have just gotten a sentence or two in med school about intersex bodies. The parents, like you said, they're exhausted. They're making this split-second decision. Like the last thing they're thinking about is this stuff. So, yeah. And so part of what we're doing is we have been legislatively, we've been passing bills and at the local level ordinances. So New York City was the first city in the country to do this. Austin was second. And then they scaled it statewide in New York recently. I believe it's still waiting on a signature from the governor, but it's passed out of the House and the Senate, the two legislative bodies in New York State, where we're passing legislation that requires a public education campaign that targets parents and doctors of intersex kids so that they have access to information from day one.
Yeah.
Ideally, the doctors have it before they're dealing with these parents, and then parents have it as soon as they know, if they find out, you know, when the kid is in utero, or at the very least, if they find out in the delivery room, that they have access to medically accurate and human rights vetted information so that they can make more better informed decisions. So again, we've been passing this city by city. It's hard to pass it statewide in red states.
Yeah.
We've also been trying to push it federally. We've been working with the Biden administration on a report. So as part of the executive order that President Biden made in Pride Month of 2022, he made this omnibus Pride Month executive order that included all these different things, one of which was like ending conversion therapy across the US. One of them was targeting homelessness in LGBTQI plus youth. One of them was requiring a year-long report on intersex health inequities. So we were working on that with Health and Human Services, and they finished the report in June of this past year. Unfortunately, they haven't released it. And I recently received word that it's because they're worried about releasing a whole new medical doctrine and protocol that is in the realm of like trans healthcare for kids the year before an election year. And so it's like we've been waiting for decades, and now apparently they're sitting on it and stalling again. And I do understand, because if we lose the White House, then everything we've worked on goes to naught. So I do understand the political context, but it is very frustrating that like right now we're having to do it on a very piecemeal basis, you know, like city by city, state by state, when it's like, I just want to do this federally. But for now, I mean, Atlanta could do something like that, where the city of Atlanta decides they want to fund a public education campaign that's going to reach doctors and parents of intersex children.
Ooh, I'd love to see you in a conversation with the city of Atlanta.
Yeah.
Certain individuals there. We could cross some issues. Some folks in this room, I think, know what I'm talking about. But as we head towards, you know, your continued trail of this book, you have told us, you know, there's things in this for the medical professionals, for people like me, for labor doulas, for us to understand, you know, what conversations are we having prenatally, also for individuals who are in school right now. You have a message to elected officials
Yep.
and politicians
Yep.
to help them understand policies. And I remember you were talking about Biden's lack of inclusion simply of I.
Yeah.
When you say certain phrases, you know, I've always had to remind individuals, just slow down when you say the acronym. Think and realize so many different individuals are being called into that moment. And so I literally cannot say that we have LGBTQ elected officials at the Capitol because we technically don't have any openly trans elected officials.
Right.
And so let's really
So
be
you have like some L's and B's.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
And so, and then, you know, me, Q. And
And a
so what we try to, of course, as you said in this book, is think about, okay, where are we sending our messages?
Yeah.
You know, with the youth, the individuals who are living, you know, their stories and are still ready to come out.
Yeah.
I know that as you've continued to share your stories, there might have been some vulnerable moments, and we
Yeah.
just want to really give you some love and some
Thank
support
you.
for that as you go forward in this journey.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if there's anything online, and if
Yes.
not, then I'll work us towards close.
No, there's just a lot of appreciation online, so no
Yes.
questions. But I do want to just lift up. Leah says this book had me laughing, happy, crying, and laughing again, and has solidified my desire for a tattoo.
Yay. Go Leah.
At your next tattoo shop,
Yes.
you should do a line of like,
So actually,
Okay.
when I left that, I don't have them on me, but we have some sticker sheets that have stickers of my tattoos, and I left them
It's
back
adorable.
at the Airbnb.
that's okay. Karis
But next
is here.
time.
Karis isn't
Karis will
going
be here.
anywhere.
That's true. I can come and drop them back.
We'll close this on out, and then I'll say a final word about how folks can get the book.
So what we've learned tonight is that we're all inverse cowgirls.
Yes.
I want you to remind us really, you know, succinctly.
Yeah.
As you're going out and telling your stories and connecting with individuals, what is the most important part of how we can be a part of your journey? How can we support you?
Yeah. So buy the book. Tell other people, tell everyone you know to buy the book. There's big ways and there's small ways. Like the big ways, there are intersex organizations like Interact, the Intersex Justice Project, Interconnect. You can find any of them. If you follow me on social media, then I'm constantly linking to different intersex organizations. So you can donate to those, you can share their content. So that those are kind of heavier lift ways. The easiest way is, and I think the reason why our movement has not gotten farther than it has is because the world is so afraid to talk about bodies. And like to talk about intersex issues, it involves talking about things like genitals or like talking about like using the word sex and stuff like that. And let me just ask a quick question. Who all in this room has a body? Literally all of us. It's the one thing every human being in the world has in common. And so it's so weird to me that we're all so afraid to talk about them. It's literally the only thing that all of us have in common. There's not one other thing in the world we all have in common besides that each of us has a body. And so I think like destigmatizing conversations about bodies and just like normalizing those discussions, that helps set the stage for conversations about intersex bodies, helping challenge people who are like, oh, like we can't talk about this like in polite society, or like it's like that's not like a comfortable dinner table discussion. That's not just going to help intersex people, that's going to help all of us. Right? So support intersex orgs, follow me, follow other intersex activists, so this isn't the only conversation you're getting about these issues. But then like really at the most basic level, it's just like help normalize having conversations about bodies. Do it at the Thanksgiving table with your racist uncle.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Alicia. We're so excited
Thank you,
you've
Park.
been
Thank you,
here.
Rep Cannon.
Thank you, Karis Books. Back to you.
Is there anything before that? Is there anything we can do to support Rep Cannon and your work?
Oh, that's super great. Check your voter registration next week, y'all.
Yeah.
They're muddy in the waters. And if you want to, you know, work the polls, or if you want to volunteer, we got you in the back.
We also have Rep Cannon's book up front.
Ooh.
Yay!
And that is a great book to help you learn how to get involved. So if you are
It's about running for office, right?
Oh yeah.
yeah. So if you're listening tonight and you're like, you know what, I need to get myself in gear because I need to be a part of this, that's a great book to help get you started. So check that out. That's up front. For folks who are watching virtually with us, you can click this teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy Inverse Cowgirl from Karis. It really does help us when you buy event books from us.
Yes.
So thank you. We also encourage you to request it at your local public library. It's really important that we get books like this on library shelves. Again, it's Banned Book Week beginning today. It's Pride Month beginning today. Make sure, as Park was saying, that when you say LGBTQIA, it actually means what you think it means.
Yes.
And then you're looking around the room and thinking about who is a part of your Pride Month festivities and who is missing.
Amen.
You know, continue to take up space in spaces where, you know, like school systems, public institutions, all of that. Ask for what we deserve in medical spaces, all of those things. So thank you all for watching tonight. We're going to say goodnight to our virtual friends.
Bye, y'all. And thank you, Karis Books.
Thank you.